The photograph sits in the National Archives, dated December 1944. It shows the horizon from the deck of an American destroyer in the Philippine Sea. The image quality isn't perfect. Wartime. Photography rarely was, but what it captures is unmistakable. Ship after ship after ship, stretching to the vanishing point. 17 aircraft carriers, 6 battleships, 13 cruisers, 58 destroyers. And from those carriers, over 1,000 aircraft ready to launch in coordinated strikes. When this photograph was taken, the Japanese combined fleet had exactly 3 operational carriers remaining. 3. The empire that had dominated the Pacific with 6 fleet carriers at Pearl Harbor now faced an American task force that could launch more aircraft in a single morning than Japan's entire remaining naval aviation capability. The story of how this happened isn't just about shipbuilding statistics, though those numbers are staggering. It's about the most catastrophic miscalculation in naval history. A miscalculation made by intelligent, experienced admirals who simply could not conceive that their enemy possessed industrial capacity on this scale. In early 1942, Japanese naval intelligence estimated American carrier construction capability at perhaps 4 fleet carriers per year. This seemed generous, even optimistic. After all, Japan's own shipyards, among the finest in Asia, required roughly 3 years to build a fleet carrier. The Americans, Japanese planners reasoned, might work faster due to their manufacturing advantages, but there were limits to what any industrial base could achieve. The reality would prove so far beyond these estimates that when Japanese commanders first received accurate intelligence reports, they assumed the information was planted. Disinformation meant to demoralize their forces. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood American industrial power better than most of his colleagues. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and traveled extensively through American industrial regions. In 1940, he warned his government, "In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." His colleagues heard these words. They nodded respectfully. But they didn't truly believe them. How could they? Japan had trained for decades to achieve qualitative superiority. Better aircraft, better pilots, better tactics. The Americans had numbers, yes, but numbers without quality were just targets. This was the prevailing wisdom in the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters throughout 1942 and into 1943. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. This was a devastating loss, certainly, but Japanese naval planning had anticipated carrier losses in any Pacific war. What they hadn't anticipated was the impossibility of replacing them on anything resembling the American timetable. By late 1942, Japanese intelligence had begun receiving reports about American shipyard activity that seemed fantastical. One report claimed the Americans were building a new class of fleet carriers, the Essex class, at a rate of 1 ship every few months. Another report mentioned conversion of cruiser hulls into light carriers in less than a year. A third spoke of escort carriers being mass-produced from merchant ship hulls in California shipyards. The officer who compiled these reports included a note of skepticism in his assessment. These production figures, if accurate, would require shipyard capacity and manufacturing coordination beyond any precedent in naval history. Recommend verification through additional intelligence sources before accepting as factual. But the reports were factual. In 1943, the United States commissioned 14 aircraft carriers. 14 in a single year. Japan, by comparison, completed 3 light carriers and had 2 fleet carriers under construction. That wouldn't enter service until 1944. The Essex-class program represented American industrial planning at its most ambitious. Each carrier displaced 27,000 tons, measured 872 feet long, and could operate over 90 aircraft. The ships featured advanced damage control systems, superior radar, and defensive armament that included 12 5-inch guns and dozens of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons. They were, by any objective measure, among the finest aircraft carriers ever built, and the Americans were building them like automobiles. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, was commissioned in December 1942. USS Yorktown followed in April 1943, not a replacement for the carrier lost at Midway, but a new ship that honored the name. Then came Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Lexington. The names rolled on month after month. By the end of the war, 24 Essex-class carriers had been completed, with more under construction when Japan surrendered. Japanese naval commanders reviewing intelligence reports in Tokyo struggled to accept these numbers. The American shipbuilding program they were seeing described didn't just exceed their own capabilities, it exceeded their conception of what shipbuilding could achieve. One senior officer famously remarked that if the Americans could build carriers this quickly, perhaps we are not fighting a nation but rather an entire, industrialized continent that simply hasn't finished warming up yet. He was closer to the truth than he knew. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 provided the first full demonstration of what American carrier superiority actually meant in combat. The engagement became known to American sailors as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the nickname wasn't mere bravado. Task Force 58, under Admiral Mark Mitcher, deployed 15 aircraft carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers. Together, they operated 956 aircraft. Against them, the Japanese mobile fleet brought 9 carriers with 473 aircraft, supplemented by several hundred land-based aircraft from Guam, Rota, and other Marianas Island bases. On paper, the forces seemed somewhat comparable. In reality, they weren't even fighting the same kind of war anymore. On the morning of June 19th, Japanese Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his first strike, 69 aircraft heading toward the American fleet. American radar picked them up at a range of 150 miles. Hellcat fighters were vectored to intercept while the bombers stayed aboard the carriers, safely out of harm's way. 42 of the 69 Japanese aircraft were shot down before reaching the American fleet. Of the remaining 27, most were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. 2 American ships suffered minor damage. Ozawa launched 3 more strikes that day. The pattern repeated with mechanical inevitability. Japanese aircraft appeared on radar. American fighters intercepted. Most Japanese planes were destroyed before reaching their targets. The few that got through faced a wall of anti-aircraft fire from ships equipped with radar-directed guns and proximity-fused ammunition. By sunset on June 19th, the Japanese had lost approximately 350 carrier-based aircraft and 200 land-based aircraft. American losses totaled 30 aircraft, and most of those were operational losses, not combat casualties. The Japanese also lost 3 carriers that day: Taiho and Shokaku to American submarine torpedoes, and Hiyo to air attack the following day. The battle effectively destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as a fighting force. The Americans had eliminated Japanese air power while barely exposing their own bombers to risk. This wasn't combat. This was industrial capacity expressing itself through radar, fighters, and doctrine that treated carriers not as precious individual assets, but as components in an integrated fleet system. Admiral Ozawa survived the battle and later reflected on what he had witnessed. In post-war interviews, he acknowledged that after the Philippine Sea, he understood the war was already lost. The Americans had so many carriers, so many aircraft, that even trading losses 1-for-1, which we could not achieve, would have left them with overwhelming superiority. We were trying to fight mass production with military spirit, and mass production does not care about spirit. The next major engagement came in October 1944 at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, the largest naval battle in history, involving over 200,000 personnel and hundreds of ships. For the Japanese, this was a last desperate gamble to destroy the American landing forces and change the war's trajectory. For the Americans, It was another operation supported by overwhelming carrier power. Task Force 38, renumbered from Task Force 58, but essentially the same force, now deployed 17 aircraft carriers with over 1,000 aircraft. The Japanese committed virtually everything they had left: 4 aircraft carriers, 9 battleships, 14 heavy cruisers, 6 light cruisers, and 35 destroyers. But those 4 Japanese carriers carried only 116 aircraft among them, just barely more than a single American Essex-class carrier's air group. In fact, the Japanese carriers at Leyte Gulf weren't even intended as striking forces. They were decoys. Admiral Somu Toyoda's plan called for the carriers to lure American forces north, while Japanese battleships attacked the landing beaches from the south. The carriers, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, had been reduced to bait in a desperate gambit. The gambit failed. American submarines detected the Japanese forces approaching. American carrier aircraft found them and attacked with devastating effectiveness. Over the course of 4 days, the Japanese lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. American losses totaled 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. What's remarkable isn't just the lopsided casualty ratio, it's what the battle revealed about operational tempo. American carriers could launch multiple strikes per day, recover aircraft, rearm them, and launch again while maintaining defensive patrols and conducting search operations. The logistics system supporting this, the ammunition ships, fuel tankers, supply vessels, and coordination, represented industrial organization at a scale Japan simply couldn't match. After Leyte Gulf, the Japanese combined fleet effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The remaining ships had no fuel for training, no aircraft for the surviving carriers, and no realistic hope of affecting the war's outcome. American carriers ranged across the Pacific virtually unopposed, striking targets in the Philippines, Formosa, Okinawa, and eventually the Japanese home islands themselves. In July 1945, American carriers launched strikes against targets near Tokyo, not some outlying island garrison, but the enemy capital itself. The carriers operated with such impunity that they recovered aircraft in daylight hours within sight of the Japanese coast. Photographs from this period show rows of American carriers, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, steaming in formation through seas the Japanese Navy had once considered their exclusive domain. Japanese naval officers watching these formations from shore positions understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. One officer, in his diary, wrote, "We prepared for war against the United States Navy. What arrived was something different, an industrial system that builds ships faster than we can sink them, that trains pilots faster than we can shoot them, down that produces weapons faster than we can expend ammunition against them. We brought swords to fight a factory." The numbers tell the story in stark terms. During World War II, the United States commissioned Essex-class fleet carriers, Independence-class light carriers, over 120 escort carriers, battleships, 48 cruisers, 49 destroyers, 498 destroyer escorts, 203 submarines. Japan, during the same period, commissioned fleet carriers, light carriers, battleships, 9 cruisers, 3 destroyers, 126 submarines. The American advantage wasn't just quantitative, it was temporal. American ships weren't just more numerous, they arrived faster, replacing losses before those losses could be exploited. When the USS Princeton was sunk at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, 3 more Essex-class carriers were already under construction and would enter service before the war ended. When Japan lost a carrier, that hole in their fleet remained. Perhaps the most telling comparison involves training. By 1944, American carriers served as training platforms where new pilots could gain carrier qualification experience on actual combat vessels before joining operational squadrons. The ships were so numerous and the pilots so plentiful that some carriers spent months doing nothing but training operations, Japan, meanwhile, was training pilots on land bases because they had no carriers to spare, then sending those pilots directly into combat with no actual carrier landing experience. Many died attempting their first combat deck landing. This wasn't just industrial superiority. It was industrial superiority so complete that it reshaped the nature of warfare itself. After the war, American naval analysts studied Japanese planning, documents and intelligence assessments captured from naval headquarters. What they found was a consistent pattern of underestimation, not through stupidity or arrogance in the conventional sense, but through inability to conceive of industrial capacity at American scale. Japanese planners had assumed American shipbuilding would follow pre-war patterns, perhaps somewhat accelerated by wartime urgency. They hadn't imagined assembly line techniques being applied to capital ship construction. They hadn't anticipated welding replacing riveting, prefabrication replacing sequential construction, or standardization replacing customization. They had planned for an enemy navy. They got an enemy manufacturing sector that happened to produce ships. One captured document from mid-1943 is particularly poignant. It's a Japanese naval intelligence assessment trying to explain how American carrier production could possibly match the reports they were receiving. The analyst concludes that the Americans must be sacrificing quality for quantity, building inferior ships quickly rather than superior ships slowly. He reassures his commanders that these mass-produced vessels will prove vulnerable in combat, their hastily trained crews unable to match the skill of veteran Japanese sailors. History proved otherwise. The Essex-class carriers were superb ships, arguably the finest carrier design of World War II. Their damage control systems were so effective that several survived kamikaze strikes that would have sunk earlier designs. Their crews, trained in large numbers through systematic programs, operated with an efficiency that Japanese forces could never match. Quality and quantity, it turned out, weren't opposites. They were complementary elements of the same industrial system. USS Franklin absorbed 2 armor-piercing bombs and survived. USS Bunker Hill took 2 kamikaze strikes and survived. USS Enterprise, the most decorated American ship of the war, was hit repeatedly by bombs, kamikaze aircraft, and shells, and survived everything Japan could throw at her. These ships, built quickly by American standards, proved almost impossible to sink. The lesson extends beyond naval history into something more fundamental about warfare and industrial society. The Japanese had prepared for a certain kind of war, a war where individual skill, superior tactics, and warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantages. This wasn't unreasonable. Throughout history, smaller forces had defeated larger ones through superior leadership, training, and fighting spirit. But World War II represented something new. Total industrial warfare, where the productive capacity behind the front lines mattered more than the fighting skills at the front itself. Japan fought superbly with what they had. But what they had could never match what America could produce, especially once American industry fully mobilized. Admiral Yamamoto had understood this. His warning, "I will run wild for 6 to 12 months. But then, WWII," acknowledged that Japan's only hope was a knockout blow before American production reached full capacity. Pearl Harbor was meant to be that blow, but it didn't destroy the American carriers. They were at sea. And it didn't break American will. Instead, it awakened the industrial giant Yamamoto had feared. By December 1944, when that photograph was taken showing Task Force 38's massive array of ships, the war's outcome had been determined not at Midway or Guadalcanal or Philippine Sea. Though, those battles mattered. But in shipyards in Newport News, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn, where workers were building carriers in less time than it took to train their air groups, the photograph remains in the archives, a silent testament to industrial capacity as a weapon of war. 17 carriers stretching to the horizon, each one carrying enough aircraft to overwhelm most air forces of the era. Behind them, more carriers under construction. Behind those, the shipyards and factories and training facilities that made the whole system possible. Somewhere, Japanese admirals had looked at pre-war intelligence reports about American industrial capacity and dismissed the numbers as impossible. Somewhere, Japanese planners had calculated that American will would break before American production reached full capacity. Somewhere, experienced naval officers had assumed that a qualitative edge, better pilots, better tactics, better spirit, could overcome a quantitative disadvantage. They were wrong, not because they were poor planners or inadequate strategists, but because they were planning for one kind of war, while their enemy was prepared to wage another kind entirely. They brought the finest traditions of naval warfare to a fight against mass production, and mass production is utterly indifferent to tradition. The photograph shows the result: a horizon filled with ships, each one carrying aircraft, each aircraft carrying weapons, all of it supplied by an industrial system operating at a scale unprecedented in human history. It's not a triumphant image exactly. It's something more sobering, a picture of what happens when industrial capacity becomes the dominant factor in warfare, when the factory proves more decisive than the battlefield. And in the archives, in captured Japanese documents, are the intelligence reports that estimated 4 American carriers per year, the planning documents that assumed American production would follow familiar patterns, the assessments that confused underestimation with analysis. History doesn't record what those Japanese admirals thought when they first saw accurate reports of American carrier strength in late 1944, when they understood that the enemy wasn't building a navy but rather mass-producing one, and that everything they'd planned for had been inadequate. But it does record what they saw: 17 carriers launching 1,000 aircraft, and behind those carriers, more being built, always more being built, an endless steel tide that no amount of skill or spirit could turn back. The lesson was written in ships, steel, and industrial capacity.